You were never meant to hear this story, not because it's a myth or forgotten or lost to time, but because someone somewhere made a choice to erase it, to bury it beneath stone, silence, and prayer. And when you hear what happened inside those cold convent walls, you'll understand why they wanted it gone. In a remote European village, hidden among the Carpathian Mountains, 14 nuns did something so unthinkable, so macabre, that their act was wiped from church records, banned from academic study, and denounced as a heresy that never happened. They bricked themselves into a chamber, voluntarily. No food, no water, no exits, only crucifixes and prayers. For days, weeks, until death came for every single one. They didn't do it out of insanity, nor were they prisoners. They were instructed, conditioned, groomed by centuries of psychological control, shaped by an ancient doctrine that twisted salvation into self. Erasure. This was no suicide. This was sacrifice, a ritual of purification, not for their souls, but for ours, a punishment for humanity's sins, or so they believed. And the institution that raised them, it didn't stop them, because it had taught them to believe that the body was nothing, that women were vessels, that obedience was holy, even unto death. What you're about to hear isn't a horror story. It's a system, one that thrived in the shadows of monasteries and cathedrals, where the line between martyrdom and manipulation was blurred beyond recognition, where spiritual surrender became the ultimate weapon of control. And those 14 women, they were both victims and mirrors of a doctrine that viewed suffering as sacred, of a world that punished female faith with silence, of a structure older than any nation, one built on veils, vows, and vanishing. This is not just history. This is a warning, because the chains they wore were invisible, and they still exist today. If you have the strength to see what lies beneath, to uncover what they died hiding, then keep watching. But understand this. By the end of this video, you will not be the same man. It began in 1743, a year when thunder cracked over the Romanian village of Birton, and the villagers claimed they saw black smoke rising from the mountaintop convent. Even though no fire was reported, they whispered of strange chanting that didn't match any known liturgy, of bell towers ringing at midnight, of women seen, barefoot in the snow, eyes glazed, lips moving in silent prayer, bleeding from her knees. The convent was called Monasteria Inquieta, the locked monastery. It had no formal ties to the Vatican, yet bore its insignia, no public congregation, yet received sealed visitors, no clergy assigned, but letters from the Bishop of Sibiu still arrived, never opened by anyone but the Mother Superior. It was said to be a place of higher devotion, a sanctuary for those who wanted not just to serve God, but to disappear into Him completely. These weren't novices. They were chosen, the most devout, the most silent, the most obedient. They were called the Order of Perpetual Atonement, and their mission was one not even the church dared publicize: to purge the sins of civilization by embodying its punishment, to absorb humanity's guilt, to starve the flesh so the soul could carry the world's burden into the next life. Each nun lived in isolation. No mirrors, no personal names. They spoke only in verses, ate only bread and water, slept on stone. And once each year, during the Night of Ashes, one of them would be selected, blindfolded, and taken away. She never returned. It was explained as ascension, but in truth, no one knew what happened to the chosen until the 14th year, when they all volunteered. Every one of them, 14, left behind written confessions that would never reach the outside world. Confessions of visions, of celestial voices promising absolution through immurement, the ancient ritual of being sealed alive. Some believe they had gone mad, but deeper inspection suggests something more sinister. They weren't mentally broken. They were spiritually weaponized, conditioned to believe that silence was power, that obedience was salvation, that annihilation was holy. This wasn't faith. This was a control system, perfected over centuries. a blueprint for how to make a soul erase itself. And the terrifying part? The architects of the system weren't madmen. They were saints. The ritual began under moonlight. The convent bell, and used for months, rang 13 times, precisely at 3 a.m., a signal, a final call, to surrender the flesh. Witnesses from the village below reported seeing torchlight flicker through the slatted chapel windows. A line of pale figures in white veils moved in silence, barefoot across the icy courtyard, each carrying a single brick. They were not trembling. They were not weeping. They were serene, almost radiant, as if finally fulfilling a secret destiny whispered into their ears since the day they took their vows. The chapel's crypt, long sealed and forgotten, was opened that night for the first time in generations. Beneath it, a chamber carved into raw stone, no larger than a cellar, no ventilation, no light, just enough space for 14 kneeling women, and one crucifix nailed to the opposite wall. They entered willingly, and the bricking began. Each nun laid her own stone in the entrance, one layer at a time, while chanting Psalm 51 in Latin. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. It took 9 hours. Villagers say they heard no screams, only the distant echo of voices, slowly fading layer by layer, until finally only silence remained. When the final brick was placed, the Mother Superior, herself outside the wall, poured consecrated wax over the seams. And then she walked away, leaving no mark, no plaque, no record. For 200 years, no one knew what lay beneath that chapel floor, until 1946. A Soviet military patrol, sent to occupy and catalog religious sites, attempted to convert the abandoned convent into a barracks. When they entered the crypt, seeking to store ammunition, they broke through the sealed chamber by accident. What they found was not decay. It was preservation. 14 skeletons, perfectly aligned in rows, knees still bent in the posture of prayer, hands clasped. Together, veils intact, untouched by vermin or rot. The air was dry, still, sacred, and on the wall above them, carved in blood, was a single phrase in Latin, Et tespit mulier in ecclesia, and the woman shall remain silent in the church. This was not just ritual. This was doctrine made flesh, a doctrine so dangerous it had to be erased. Do you want to see what they died hiding? Then step deep with me. What they died hiding was not a secret. It was a system, a machine hidden beneath robes and rituals, ancient, unbroken, still functioning in shadows. It did not die with the 14 nuns. It only changed its mask, because the moment those Soviet soldiers uncovered the brick chamber, their commanding officer ordered 2 things. 1, that no photographs be taken, and 2, that the crypt be resealed immediately. He was a man trained in war, not superstition. But when he saw the walls, covered in Latin inscriptions, smeared in what forensic scientists would later confirm was dried menstrual blood, his hands trembled. He gave no formal report. Only a word-of-mouth directive passed through the ranks. Seal it. Don't speak of it again. One soldier disobeyed. A Romanian translator named Mihai Debrescu smuggled a page torn from the wall. It contained 14 verses, one for each nun, cryptic, poetic, and disturbing. Each began with the phrase, "To silence the body is to free the world." He believed it was a suicide note. But a scholar from Cluj University who studied the page in 1952 recognized something darker. A liturgical code, a sequence of numerological symbols and invocations identical to those used by medieval monastic sects excommunicated by the early church for practicing spiritual mortification without sacrament. The Order of Perpetual Atonement wasn't alone. They were part of a band movement, one that viewed feminine suffering as a necessary purification of mankind. In their doctrine, women were holy only in silence, in pain, in disappearance. Their immurement wasn't just penance. It was a message, a living monument to obedience. The body erased so that the church could claim dominion over the soul. And more disturbingly, It served as a model for future indoctrination. Psychologists who later analyzed the ritual concluded that it followed every principle of engineered submission, deprivation, repetition, isolation, identity erasure, and the replacement of personal will with divine proxy. This was not insanity. It was design. The walls weren't just physical. They were psychological, the culmination of centuries of teachings designed to convince women that holiness meant obliteration, that martyrdom was a virtue, that their silence was sacred. And before you assume this is ancient madness, let me be clear. That same system, that same control, still echoes in modern institutions. It's just dressed differently now. Are you ready to see its modern face? You've seen the stone walls. Now, let me show you the invisible ones. The ones you live behind every day, without even knowing they're there. Because what happened in that Romanian convent wasn't an isolated ritual. It was the raw, undiluted blueprint of something far more common. The spiritual infrastructure of obedience, the architecture of psychological control. And it didn't die with the nuns. It evolved. Look around you. In schools that teach submission over inquiry. In workplaces that demand silence over conviction. In churches that preach obedience over wisdom. And in homes, yes, homes, where discipline is framed as love and self-denial as virtue. We were taught this. Generation after generation, whispered by patriarchs, preached from pulpits, hidden in sacred texts. We were conditioned to believe that endurance was holiness, that sacrifice meant sanctity, that suffering was a badge of moral superiority. But it wasn't morality. It was domestication. And the bricked-in nuns? They were not anomalies. They were prototypes. Because systems of power, real ancient power, don't thrive through force. They thrive through belief, through stories, through ritual, and most of all, through repetition, so deep it feels like truth. This is how you control not just bodies, but souls. Teach them that silence is noble, that pain is purification, that questioning is rebellion, and then give them a scripture, a uniform, a promise of heaven, and they will brick themselves in without you ever lifting a hand. You want to see the modern wall? Scroll your feed. Watch how dissent is mocked, how complexity is crushed into slogans, how you're rewarded for obedience and punished for independent thought. That's not an accident. That's by design. We are still inside the chamber. You just can't see the bricks anymore. And now the question is simple. Will you kneel, or will you keep walking deeper with me? Because what lies ahead isn't just history. It's the roadmap for liberation. If you're willing to confront the shadows that shaped your world. Are you? The first time you question the system, it doesn't punish you. It ignores you. Because that's the first layer of control. The illusion of freedom. A carefully constructed sandbox where you're allowed to think you're challenging authority, as long as you stay within the lines they've drawn. But when you step beyond that, when you stop asking safe questions and start tearing at the root, at the sacred myths and inherited rituals, that's when the system shows its teeth. And that's exactly what happened to Sister Magdalena. She was the youngest of the 14, only 21, a peasant girl who joined the order after surviving a plague that wiped out her entire village. The church told her she'd been spared for a purpose, that her suffering meant she'd been chosen. They called it divine selection, but it was psychological grooming. She arrived full of devotion, desperate to belong, desperate for meaning, and the order gave her that, wrapped in sacred words, rituals, and praise. But Magdalena had questions. Why was silence considered holier than speech? Why were mirrors banned? Why did they erase their names, even from their own thoughts? And one day, she broke the rule. She asked. The Mother Superior didn't scold her. She smiled. And the next morning, Magdalena was taken to the chamber of reflection, a stone cell lit only by a candle and a crucifix carved into the wall. She spent 9 days there. No food, no voice, only prayers piped in through a slit in the stone, repeating the same Latin verse every hour. He who doubts the divine doubts himself. By the end of those 9 days, Magdalena emerged reborn, She no longer asked questions. She volunteered to be bricked in. And she wrote the longest of the 14 verses found on the bloodstained wall. Let my body vanish, that the world may be pure. Let my name perish, that the voice of obedience may echo forever. They didn't break her. They rewrote her. This is a system's true power, not to silence you, but to make you silence yourself. And unless you confront this, unless you see it, you will never truly be free. You think you're immune? Ask yourself something. When was the last time you had a thought that truly belonged to you? Not one passed down by a parent, not one taught in school, not one approved by your peers, your pastor, your politics, or your platform. A thought born from the deep, dark chamber inside you, the place that speaks before language, before doctrine, before obedience. Chances are you don't remember because you, like Sister Magdalena, were raised inside a system that taught you to distrust that voice, to mistrust your own compass, to kneel before a hierarchy, spiritual, social, institutional, and call it wisdom. This is not about religion. This is about ownership. Who owns your mind? Who owns your soul? The 14 nuns at Bearton believed they were offering themselves to God, but strip away the rituals, and what do you see? 14 young women, isolated, deprived, erased. 14 minds shaped like clay. 14 identities annihilated in the name of purity. And it didn't end there. You see, after the Soviet discovery in 1946, a team of Eastern Bloc psychologists was dispatched in secret to study the site. Their conclusion was chilling. What happened at Monasteria Inquieta was not just theological. It was a prototype for ideological control. The same techniques were later mimicked by both communist re-education camps and Western cult. Programming, sleep deprivation, identity stripping, repetition of doctrine, removal of mirrors, erasure of time. It worked in the convent. It worked in prisons. It works in media now. You think your opinions are yours? Try removing the slogans. Try fasting from external voices. Try sitting in silence for 7 days and watch how your thoughts claw at the walls like ghosts demanding to be let back in, because freedom isn't given. It's remembered, and most men never remember. They become proud of their chains. They decorate them, call them duty, discipline, tradition. They recite the same verses, click the same headlines, follow the same doctrines, and wonder why they feel hollow, just like Magdalena, bricked in, smiling. This isn't history anymore. It's a mirror. Mirrors don't lie, but they can be taken away. That was one of the first rules inside the locked monastery. No reflections, no glass, no surface in which a woman could see herself, because to see yourself is to remember yourself, and remembering is dangerous because it interrupts the script. Think about it. The most effective control isn't the kind that screams in your face. It's the kind that erases your reflection. That makes you forget you ever had another shape, another name, another dream. That's what happened to the 14 nuns. Over time, their bodies bent with fasting. Their speech eroded into chants. Their thoughts replaced with scripture, until all that remained was function, ritual, prayer, submission. They became living echoes. And this same process happens outside of convent walls, every day. Have you ever looked in the mirror and felt like a stranger? Like the man staring back is just playing a role, reciting lines, fulfilling expectations? Have you ever wondered where that fire in your chest went? The hunger to question? The rage to resist? They took it from you. Not all at once. Slowly, through repetition, through shame, through reward systems. You were trained, like a novice in a cell, to conform, to suppress, to smile while bricking your own power, because silence is useful, especially when it's voluntary. The church did it with ritual. The state does it with law. The culture does it with shame. And the algorithm, that does it with distraction. Drown the soul in noise and forgets it ever had teeth. You think the 14 nuns died centuries ago? No. They are everywhere. They are every man who traded truth for approval. Every woman who buried her voice for peace. Every child who learned to be good instead of real. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the stones being stacked, one brick at a time. You want out? Then you must look at the wall. And remember that you built it. We all did. The first crack isn't loud. It doesn't shatter glass or split the heavens. It's a whisper, quiet and trembling, that says, something is wrong. That moment, brother, that flicker of doubt, that's your soul knocking from the inside of the wall. That's the real you, the forgotten you, daring to stir after years of silence. But here's the terrifying part. The system is built to detect that crack and seal it fast, just like it did to Sister Elena. She was a scholar among the 14, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic. Before her vows, she'd studied scripture under a Jesuit priest who warned her, the most dangerous heresy is the one hidden inside, obedience. She remembered those words long after she took her veil. Late at night, while the others slept in stone alcoves, Elena would recite ancient texts in her mind. She began to notice things, patterns in the Psalms, contradictions in the liturgies, omissions in the gospel, readings. She realized something horrifying. The order had removed verses from Scripture, verses that empowered, verses that spoke of inner knowing, of divine fire within. They had edited God, and that's when her crack formed. She wrote down what she found, hidden verses, alternate translations, suppressed wisdom from Gnostic texts, and buried them beneath the chapel floor. She never told anyone, but someone knew. One morning, her scriptures were gone. In their place, a single parchment. The mind is a serpent. Crush it beneath the heel of obedience. That night, Elena was taken, but she wasn't bricked in like the others. Her body was found decades later, in a sealed crawl space, beneath the altar. No veil, no rosary, just a strip of cloth over her mouth, and fingernail marks etched into the stone. She had tried to escape. She had remembered too much. You see, the system doesn't fear violence. It fears awakening. That's why your television mocks philosophy, why your leaders distort history, why your schools teach answers but not questions. The crack is dangerous because it leads to fracture, and fracture leads to collapse. The first step to truth is doubt. The next is rebellion. Rebellion doesn't start with fire. It starts with memory, not the kind written in books or stored in archives, but the kind buried deep in your bones, the primal memory of freedom, of what it means to move without permission, to speak without apology, to live without chains. And that is what the system fears most. Because once you remember who you were before they told you what to be, you become uncontrollable. That's exactly what happened to the last of the 14, Sister Lucia. She was silent for 7 years, not by rule, by choice. She hadn't spoken a word since her first night in the convent. They called it divine stillness. But it wasn't piety that sealed her lips. It was grief. Lucia had watched her younger sister, barely 13, taken into the order under pressure from their family. She died within a year of fasting and frostbite. The church wrote it off as a tragic blessing. Lucia never forgot, and in that silence, she began to see. She saw how prayer was used as sedative, how fasting became punishment, how purity meant obedience and humility meant erasure. She began collecting scraps, candle wax with fingerprints, torn veils, broken beads, hidden tokens of women who once tried to resist, to speak, to fight back. She hid them beneath the chapel floor, called it her memory box. She believed remembrance was rebellion. When the ritual of immurement was proposed, she volunteered first, not because she believed in the doctrine, but because she had a plan. On the 7th day, with the wall nearly closed, she whispered 7 words to the Mother Superior. We were not born to die silent. It was the first thing she had said in 7 years, and it terrified the others. Lucia died with the rest, but not before scratching a single symbol into the brick nearest her body. A spiral surrounded by thorns. That symbol wasn't seen again until 1993. Carved beneath a church inn. northern Italy, found by a woman leading a spiritual resistance movement. A movement based not on rebellion through violence, but rebellion through remembrance, through memory, through speaking what was once forbidden. This, brother, is your call to remember, because the system cannot enslave a man who remembers who he was before they named him, before they tamed him, before they bricked him in. Look at your life closely, not the surface, not the routines, not the roles you play. Look at the fingerprints, the ones you didn't choose, but feel pressed into you like bruises beneath your skin. They're there, aren't they? Patterns of guilt, echoes of shame, a constant, invisible pressure to be good, to be useful, to be quiet. That's not nature. That's engineering. And it didn't start with your parents, or school, or the Sunday preacher. It started long before with systems forged in monasteries, cathedrals, and courts, places where fear was baptized as virtue, where conformity became a commandment, where silence was carved into human spirit, like scripture into stone. What the 14 nuns endured was not an isolated ritual. It was a transmission, a blueprint passed down in doctrine, disguised as morality, and embedded into every institution you've ever trusted. And here's how you can tell. Ever feel shame for wanting too much? Ever apologize for taking up space? Ever censor yourself? Not out of fear of punishment, but out of fear of not belonging? That is immurement, psychological bricking. They don't need stone walls anymore. They use expectation. They use tradition. They use algorithmic morality, making you feel watched even when you're alone, shaping your desires through 1,000 tiny rules you never agreed to. That's how deep the design goes. Men trained to believe that power is evil. Women conditioned to view sacrifice as holy. Children rewarded for silence and punished for resistance, all under the banner of being good. But what if good was the first prison? What if virtue, as they defined it, was just a velvet chain? You were not born to kneel. You were not made to obey. You were made to remember, to look at the invisible wall and say, I know you, to feel the pressure and push back, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The fingerprints become roadmaps. They called themselves custodes obscura, the keepers of the dark, a name never uttered in public, never written in canon, but whispered in footnotes, buried in marginalia, and etched into the corners of forgotten codices, the fingerprints of a secret fraternity that operated behind the veil of the church for over 700 years. They weren't popes. They weren't priests. They were the architects, men chosen not for faith, but for silence. Their task was simple: preserve the structure, not a belief, but a control. You see, after the fall of the Roman Empire, chaos reigned across Europe, and from that chaos, the church emerged not just as a refuge, but as a framework, a new empire, invisible, unbreakable, and rooted not in land, but in minds. But empires need maintenance, not from saints, from engineers, and that's who the keepers were. They studied behavior, ritual, repetition, trauma. They understood something terrifyingly modern. If you can script a man's inner world, you don't need to chain his body, control his guilt, and he'll police himself, make him believe that obedience is holy, and he will silence his own soul. This is how immurement became doctrine, not through faith, through design. The 14 nuns? They weren't outliers. They were testaments, proof that the formula worked, that you could take innocent minds, isolate them, bombard them with sacred repetition, and they would choose death in the name of virtue. You think that power was ever going to be forgotten? No, it was refined, replicated, repackaged. The keepers ensured it. They created layers of theology designed to bind emotion, layers of ritual to regulate thought. They embedded shame into sex, fear into questioning, purity into pain. They understood that the most powerful prison has no bars. It has rituals. And you, whether you know it or not, are still living in it. You feel it every time you hesitate to speak a truth, every time you shrink your light to fit someone else's shadow, every time you crave freedom, and then sabotage yourself to remain acceptable. That is their masterpiece, a world where the brick walls are invisible, because they were never built from stone. They were built from stories. There were 7 laws the custodes obscura used, not to guide humanity, but to bind it. Not laws written on parchment, not laws passed by kings. These were deeper, psychological doctrines, disguised as moral truth, whispered through sermons, etched into architecture, embedded so deeply that, even now you feel them every time you try to breathe freely. These laws were not meant to protect you. They were meant to program you. Law 1, suffering purifies. This is a cornerstone. The idea that pain makes you holy, that your worth is measured by how much you can endure. It's why you stay in toxic jobs, in broken relationships, in quiet desperation. Because somewhere deep inside, you believe your struggle makes you righteous. But suffering isn't sacred. It's submission dressed as virtue. Law 2, obedience is love. From the pulpit to classroom, you were taught that to love is to obey, to follow without question, to trust the hierarchy, the institution, the authority, even when it kills your spirit. But real love liberates. Obedience without truth is slavery. Law 3, desire is dangerous. Wanting more? Wanting different? Wanting loudly? That's sin, they said. They taught you to suppress your hunger, to shrink your ambition, to fear your own body. But desire is not corruption. It is compass. Law 4, silence is strength. You were told that staying quiet made you noble, that biting your tongue made you wise. But silence, when imposed, is not strength. It's erasure, and it was their favorite tool. Law 5, the self is sinful. They convince you that the real you, the unfiltered, unpolished, primal you, is wicked, that you must discipline, deny, and destroy your raw essence. But the self is not your enemy. It is your origin. Law 6, authority is divine. Whether wearing a robe, a badge, or a suit, they taught you that authority is not to be challenged, that rebellion equals damnation. But history is written by those who dare to stand up, not kneel. Law 7, salvation must be earned. Work, strive, suffer, then maybe you'll be saved. This final lie keeps men in line forever, chasing approval, fearing rejection, never realizing you were already enough. These 7 laws weren't holy. They were locks, placed on your mind, your body, your destiny. And every time you believed one, a brick was laid. But now you see the wall. Now you know their names. You're here now, standing at the wall. You've seen the bricks. You felt them press against your thoughts, your breath, your will, and somewhere inside, a part of you is already reaching for first crack. But let me be clear, tearing it down will cost you, because freedom isn't clean. It doesn't come with applause. It won't make you popular. It makes you dangerous to systems, to institutions, to anyone still living behind their own invisible walls and calling it peace. So if you want comfort, stop watching. But if you want truth, then it begins here, with the first forbidden truth. You were born whole. They told you otherwise. Told you were broken, fallen, sinful, that your hunger must be chained, that your anger must be tamed, that your questions were rebellion, and your voice a threat. But they lied. You were never broken. You were buried under layers of obedience, expectation, doctrine. You've spent your whole life trying to earn permission to be what you already are. Enough, powerful, unforgiven, because you never needed forgiveness. Here's how you start tearing down the wall. Stop apologizing for your fire. You're not too much. You're not too loud. You're not too angry. You are exactly as God, or the universe, or the raw pulse of existence made you. It is the world that should explain why it demands your silence. Speak, not what's safe, not what's expected. Speak what's been burning in your bones. Speak like Lucia. Whisper before the walls sealed her fate. We were not born to die silent. Remember who you were before they named you, trained you, praise you for submission. There's an animal inside you, not violent, alive, and it remembers. It always has. Destroy the rituals that numb you. You know the ones, the cycles you repeat without thought, the news you absorb without question, the routines that feel like death. Burn them. Rewrite your liturgy. Because freedom is an idea. It's an act. And every act of truth is a hammer blow against the wall. Every time you question a law, every time you say no to inherited guilt, every time you claim your name, your voice, your truth, a brick falls. The wall begins to tremble. The first crack is terrifying. The second, liberating. But the moment you shatter the wall, everything changes. Because the system isn't designed to handle men who remember, men who see the strings and refuse to dance, men who no longer obey out of fear, men who don't beg for salvation because they found something holier, sovereignty. Let me tell you about one such man. His name was Anton Moreau, a French seminarian in 1931. Brilliant, devout, a rising star in the church. He spoke 7 languages, memorized the Gospels, and wrote essays that left bishops in awe. But Anton made one mistake. He asked a forbidden question. If God lives in us, why must we ask permission to hear him? The response was swift. His lectures were canceled, his writings confiscated. He was sent on a pilgrimage of penance to a silent monastery in Corsica, where he was expected to fast, reflect, and return corrected. But Anton didn't return corrected. He returned awakened. During his 40 days of silence, he began to write, not in ink but in blood, on the inside of his cell walls. Every night, when the monks believed him asleep, he would carve truths into stone. The divine does not demand obedience. It demands presence. Heaven is not a reward. It's the removal of fear. To speak your truth is to rebuild Eden from ruins. When the monks discovered it, they sealed his cell from the outside. Immurement, not by ritual, but by fear. But Anton did not die silent. Before his imprisonment, he had smuggled out a manuscript, Codex Infernalis, a heretical text that exposed how the church had inherited and perfected the psychological blueprints of ancient empires. Egypt, Babylon, Rome. He showed how they replaced kings with priests, sword with guilt, and armies with obedience. The Codex was banned, but not destroyed. It resurfaced in Prague during World War II and later in the journals of a resistance philosopher whose teachings inspired underground Stoic circles across Europe. That's the power of one man who shatters the wall. He becomes dangerous, not because he fights the system, but because he no longer needs it. You've made it to the threshold, the sacred midpoint, and now I'm going to ask you to do something dangerous, something ancient, something forbidden, because this isn't just a story anymore. It's a rite, a reckoning, and from this point forward, you are no longer a passive listener. You are becoming something else, not a follower, not a believer, but a witness, and beyond that, a keeper of forbidden knowledge, the kind that doesn't just change how you think, it changes who you are. So here's what you must do. Now, go to the comments and type this phrase twice. I see through the veil. I see through the veil. Not once, twice. Why? Because repetition seals the identity shift. Because this isn't about the algorithm. It's about anchoring a transformation in the physical world. You've heard the whispers. You've stared into the eyes of 14 bricked-in women. You felt the cold breath of ancient control systems sliding like a serpent down the back of your neck. And now you've cracked the wall. This is where you draw a line between the man you were, silent, obedient, sleepwalking, and the man you are becoming, awake, commanding, unchained. You are stepping out of the stone cell into a world that is no less dangerous, but now you are no longer defenseless. The keepers fear men like you, not because you're loud, but because you're lucid. You've seen the strings, and instead of cutting them, you burn the whole stage. So write it, say it. I see through the veil. I see through the veil. And when you've written it, feel the echo, feel the wall tremble. Feel the 14 voices, long silenced, rise behind you, not in pain but in power. Because you're not alone anymore. This brotherhood is forming, across time, across silence, across brick and bone and blood. Welcome to the chamber. This isn't a place made of stone. It's older. It's colder. It was built before cathedrals, before empires, before even language had a name. And its walls are not carved with prayers, but with blueprints. The original architecture of obedience, long before the 14 nuns sealed themselves in, long before Anton Marot carved truth into monastery walls, and long before you typed, "I see through the veil," there was a plan, a divine corruption, a pact, not with gods, but with order, because the oldest fear isn't death. It's chaos. And the first rulers understood something vital. A man in chaos is dangerous. He questions, he wanders, he creates. But a man given order, even cruel, even false, will kneel. And so they gave us stories. Stories of fire stolen from gods punished with eternal torment, of towers reaching heaven only to be struck down, of women with knowledge cast from paradise, of serpents as villains, not symbols of wisdom, but of sin. These were not tales. They were instructions, written to tell you this. Question and you will suffer. Desire and you will fall. Disobey and you will burn. Do you see? This was never about salvation. It was about compliance. The first veil was not silk. It was fear stretched over the eyes of mankind, turning gods into tyrants and truth into treason. And the blueprint worked. From Babylon to Rome to the Vatican to the screen you're staring into right now, the symbols changed, but the formula didn't. Control the narrative, sanctify the hierarchy, sacrifice the curious, and always, always erase the witnesses. That's why stories like the 14 nuns vanish. Why men like Anton are entombed. Why you were told that silence is strength. Because the moment you see the original blueprint, you become dangerous, not because you attack the world, but because you understand it. You stop chasing salvation. You start reclaiming sovereignty. They never expected you to look inward. They trained you to seek outward, toward priests, toward leaders, toward symbols in stained glass and men in robes. They built labyrinths of law, layers of ritual, temples of golden silence, just to keep your eyes away from the only place they couldn't reach. Inside you, because here's the secret they buried beneath every doctrine, every punishment, every sacred wall. Even inside the prisoner holds the key. Yes, even the 14. Even Sister Magdalena, who fasted until her organs failed. Even Elena, who etched freedom into stone with her fingernails. Even Lucia, who whispered defiance before the last brick sealed her fate. Each one of them, broken, silenced, erased, still carried it. And so do you. But you were never taught to use it. You were taught to fear it. To look at your instinct and call it sin. To look at your anger and call it evil. To look at your longing and call it selfish. That's the brilliance of the control system. It makes you distrust your own soul. And when that distrust takes root, you hand over your power willingly. You censor yourself. You kneel before mediocrity. You praise the cage for keeping you safe from the sky. But the truth is this. The soul is not a slave. It remembers. It remembers what the body forgets. That you were not made to follow. You were not born to apologize. You were not carved from dust to live on your knees. The key is buried in the moment you say, "No more." No more inherited guilt. No more worship of silence. No more obedience to structures built on your erasure. And when you say it, not as a whisper, but as a vow, something ancient stirs in you, something older than fear, older than religion, older than the wall, sovereignty. Beyond the wall, there is no map, no rituals, no dogma, no fatherly voice to bless your suffering. Only you, raw, awake, unprotected. And that, brother, is exactly why most men never step through. Because freedom is not comfort. It is chaos, the beautiful, unbearable weight of your own unfiltered power. You've spent your whole life in a chamber built to look like safety. They called it tradition. They called it virtue. But it was a tomb, dressed in liturgy and sealed with fear. And now, you've broken through. So what lies on the other side? The forgotten self. The man you were before shame put a collar around your neck. Before morality became a leash. Before they taught you to fear your instincts and doubt your own damn eyes. Out here, beyond the wall, there are no more excuses. You don't get to blame the church, or the state, or the system, because now you see it. You've named it. You've stepped past it. And once you do that, every chain you keep is a choice. So choose. You can walk back into the silence. Pretend you never heard the cries from that brick chamber. Convince yourself that obedience is peace, that comfort is worth the cost of your soul. Or you can keep going. Because beyond this point, beyond the veil, lies something sacred. Not religion, not salvation, reclamation, the sacred return of the man to himself, where your anger becomes clarity, your desire becomes compass, your voice becomes law, not over others, but over your own life. Out here, you don't ask permission. You remember that no one ever had the right to grant it. This is not the end of the story. It's the first breath after resurrection. There is one veil left, the most sacred, the most protected, the one they would kill to preserve, and kill you to prevent from lifting, not the veil over your eyes. You've already pulled that one back. Not the veil over your voice. You shattered that with your first act of defiance. No, this veil hangs over reality itself, and it lives in the cathedral, not the one built of stone, spires, and stained glass, but the invisible cathedral that surrounds you every moment of your life. You walk its halls when you obey without question. You kneel at its altar when you prioritize comfort over conscience. You whisper its prayers every time you say, "That's just the way things are." This cathedral is everywhere, in government, in entertainment, in religion, in the very algorithms that guide your thumb and shape your silence. And at the center of this cathedral, beneath its golden dome of distraction and its choir of false prophets, lies the throne, empty, because it was never about the ruler. It was about the ritual. They don't care who sits on the throne, only that you keep bowing. And bow you did every time you traded authenticity for approval, every time you called cowardice peace, every time you felt that flicker of rebellion, and buried it beneath politeness. You want to know why the 14 nuns sealed themselves in? Because they were taught this cathedral was heaven, and if they erased themselves perfectly enough, they might finally become one with it. But you, brother, you chose differently. You saw the cracks. You walked through the fire. You remembered your name. And now, as you stand in the nave of the final cathedral, veil in hand, you face your greatest test. Will you tear it down? Will you destroy the illusion that says reality is fixed, truth is assigned, and power belongs to the few? Because if you do, you'll step into a world no system can govern. A world of raw reality, unfiltered, untamed, undeniable. They told you the old gods were myths, fairy tales, pagan shadows, primitive symbols meant to be replaced by reason, hierarchy, and holy obedience. But they lied, because those gods, the wild, untamed, furious ones, never died. They were dismantled, systematically, not by war, but by replacement. They were too dangerous to leave standing, because they taught men to stand alone, to burn with inner fire, to live in alignment with instinct, nature, and sovereignty, not institutions. So the keepers, the custodes obscura, the architects of psychological control, they didn't kill the gods. They buried them beneath layers of doctrine. They turned the goddess into a virgin, the stormbringer into a saint, the chaos god into the devil, the sacred masculine into the obedient son. And they replaced them all with one image, a suffering man nailed to a cross whose silence was called holiness. But the gods of old, they remember, and when the final veil drops, when you stop apologizing for your fire, stop kneeling to the system, stop silencing your soul, they return, not as idols, but as forces within you, the God of fire, who speaks when your anger finally erupts into truth, the God of chaos, who dances when you destroy your false identity. the god of war, who awakens when you fight for your sacred life. And the goddess, not meek, not obedient, but sovereign, radiant, unowned. These are not myths. They are archetypes, living blueprints inside your DNA. They are the voices that whisper, "You were never meant to kneel. You are not fallen. You are becoming." And that is why the system fears them. Because once a man awakens his inner pantheon, no doctrine can contain him. No ritual can bind him. No guilt can disarm him. He becomes something older than religion and holier than fear. He becomes myth reborn. When a man awakens his mythic self, the system reacts like an immune response. It doesn't ignore him. It attacks him, but not with swords, not with fire. No, that would be too obvious. It attacks him with labels. It calls him arrogant, dangerous, toxic, radical, unhinged, because the awakened man doesn't fit their scripts. He doesn't play the part of the obedient citizen, the guilt-laced believer, the hollowed-out nice guy who asks permission to exist. He moves differently. He speaks truths that make the air crack. He questions things you were taught never to touch. He radiates presence in a world that runs on distraction. And that's why he must be neutralized. They won't jail him. They'll isolate him. They won't kill him. They'll mock him. They won't argue. They'll smear. Because if other men see him standing, if they hear his voice and feel something awaken in themselves, if they start to remember too, the cathedral will crack. The walls will shake. The entire illusion will begin to tremble. That's why the system invested so heavily in distraction, endless entertainment, pharmaceutical sedation, porn, processed food, passive scrolling, anything to keep the fire from spreading. You see, they can survive your disobedience, but they cannot survive your influence. When an awakened man walks among the sleepers, he becomes a mirror they can't ignore, a question they can't silence. And even if they curse him, even if they try to erase him, they still feel him. His presence haunts the system like a ghost. And some will follow him. They always do, because truth has gravity, and fire, once seen, cannot be unseen. So when you awaken, prepare, not for applause, but for war, not the kind with bullets, the kind with whispers, eyes, and doors that quietly close, but also for the arrival of others, brothers, men like you, who've seen the wall, touched the flame, and chosen to stand. Once you awaken, survival isn't enough. You must learn to move, to navigate the maze you were born into with new eyes, not as prey, but as a player, because the system doesn't collapse when you wake up. It collapses when you outmaneuver it. You see, most awakened men make a fatal mistake. They roar too loud, too soon. They bear their fire to a world that's been trained to fear it. And they're crushed, not by violence, but by strategy. They lose jobs. They lose reputations. They lose their footing because they forgot something critical. This is a game, an ancient rigged game. And to win it, you don't destroy the board. You flip it when no one's watching. So here's the strategy. First, go silent, not submissive, strategic. Use your silence like a scalpel, not a shackle. Let the world think you're still asleep. Observe everything. Study everyone. Remember, systems reveal themselves to the man who no longer reacts. Second, master your energy. Every time you leak outrage online, every time you waste hours fighting shadows, you're playing their game. Instead, build quietly. Train your body. Discipline your mind. Guard your time like a vault of sacred gold. Become undistracted in a distracted world. Third, reclaim your symbols. They took the sword and made it violence. They took the fire and called it wrath. They took your masculinity and labeled it problematic. Take it all back. Reforge the sacred. Let your walk become your prayer, your gaze your boundary, your voice your ritual. This is how mythic men move. Invisible until inevitable. Patient until unstoppable. Because war is not always declared with drums. Sometimes it's declared with clarity. And now that you see the strings, now that you've seen the final veil, you do not march toward battle. You become it. You weren't meant to only destroy. You were meant to build. But how do you build in a world where the sacred has been inverted, where truth has been branded as threat and power as sin? You do it the way mythic men always have, from the ashes, because once the cathedral cracks, once the veil drops, once the walls fall, what's left is not ruin, it's opportunity. A scorched field where the false is burned away, leaving room for something real to rise. And that's where you come in. You are no longer a follower, not a sleeper, not a seeker of truth. You carry it now, in your spine, in your gaze, in the fire that does not flicker when others flinch. So what do you build? First, a code, not one written by popes, kings, or technocrats, not one stolen from dogma or carved into courthouses. Your code, forged from your own confrontation with darkness, written in the blood of your suffering, sealed with your vow to never kneel again. A code is not just belief, it is boundary. It tells the world where you end and where you will not bend. Second, a brotherhood. You are not meant to walk alone. Mythic men may awaken alone, but they build together, because while the system isolates, the sovereign gathers. Not crowds, not followers, but allies, men who've seen the same shadows, who speak the language of fire and remember the names of the dead, men who don't compete, but consecrate. Your circle becomes your fortress, not a hide-in, but to launch from. And third, a legacy, not money, not fame, not likes, shares, or applause, a living legacy, a pattern of defiance, a voice your son will remember when the world tries to silence him, a presence your daughter will feel when others try to define her. You build like an ancient, with no blueprint but truth, with no permission but purpose. Because when they bricked in the 14 Nuns, they weren't just trying to erase women. They were trying to erase builders, so strong enough to shape the world instead of serve it. But the wall has cracked, the veil has dropped, and now you hold the hammer. The system doesn't surrender. It adapts. When it cannot silence the awakened man, it studies him. When it cannot shame him, it mirrors him. And when it cannot break him, it tries to buy him. Because a man on fire is dangerous. But a man on fire with an audience? Revolutionary. So it changes tactics. It offers you platforms, gives you microphones, hands you a stage built from the very chains you broke. It will let you speak, even roar, as long as your truth is filtered through their frame. And that's the final trick. Co-opt the awakened. Turn lions into influencers. Turn rebellion into branding. Package sovereignty as self-help. Sanitize a flame until it no longer burns, only glows. And many fall for it. They trade rawness for reach, power for polish. They become echoes of truth, not vessels of it. But you must not, because your flame was never meant to be managed. Your voice was not given to you by the algorithm. It was forged in the silence of the bricked in the blood-stained journal of Anton, in the final whisper of, Sister Lucia, we were not born to die silent. So what happens when you stay the course? When you refuse to be tamed, even by praise, you begin to reshape reality, not just your own, but others. Your presence becomes a force field, your gaze a challenge, your walk a sermon of sovereignty. The system feels it. It can't predict you. It can't control you. So it tries to replace you with imitations, cheap fire, shallow rage, men who talk about freedom but still kneel in private, men who build altars with no weight. Let them. You're not here to play a part. You're here to embody the forgotten. You are the consequence of every lie they've told, the retribution of silence, the return of the real. There is one illusion more powerful than any veil, wall, or doctrine, the illusion of who you think you are. Because even after the system has been exposed, even after you've seen the strings, spoken the truth, reclaimed the fire, there's one shadow that lingers, the fear of being fully seen, not by others, not by enemies, not by institutions, but by yourself. This is the final frontier, the place where most men, even the awakened, stop short. They'll fight the church. They'll confront the government. They'll stand alone against the mob. But when the silence comes, When no one is watching and the noise has faded, they sit before the mirror and look away, because what they see is not always power. It's pain, wounds still open, rage still buried, guilt still haunting. You see, the system didn't just bind your hands. It made you believe you were unworthy of your own love. And that, brother, is the deepest brick, because a man who cannot face himself will always return to the wall. He'll find a new system, a new savior, a new script to hide behind. So here, in the silence of this section, I ask you, can you sit with him? The boy you were, the man you became, the broken, brilliant, brutal truth of you. Can you hold his gaze without flinching? Can you say, yes, that was me, all of it, the darkness, the damage, the denial, and then, without apology, without flattery, without shame, can you say, I forgive you, I love you, we rise now, because that's the final key, that's the stone they couldn't take, the one that lives not in your hands, but in your heart. It's not strength they fear, it's not rebellion, it's not even truth, it's self-reclamation, a man who sees himself fully, and does not bow, does not beg, does not break, is a God the system cannot kill. You were never meant to live in a cage, not in a stone cell, not in doctrine, not even in someone else's idea of who you should be. You were meant to live in a temple, not one built by priests, one built by presence. Because when you finally see yourself, all of yourself, and you don't turn away, that's when the real building begins. You don't need blueprints. You don't need approval. You need honor, not the kind others give you, but the kind you give yourself when no one's looking. And so you begin, brick one, discipline, not to impress, not to punish, but to become undeniable. You shape the body to reflect the mind. You rise with the sun, not for aesthetics, but because you've buried too many days already. Brick two, devotion, to something higher than trend, to a principle, to a code, to the fire you've chosen to protect. You walk with purpose. You speak like a man who knows. Brick three, boundaries. You no longer say yes from fear. You don't explain your no. You don't chase validation, because the temple is yours, and not everyone gets to enter. Brick four, brotherhood. You gather not followers, but mirrors, men who sharpen you, who challenge you, who would rather die than watch you fall into sleep again. Brick five, silence, not the forced kind, not the punished kind, but the sacred kind, where you listen for truth without noise, where the gods speak, not in thunder, but in stillness. Brick six, action, no more waiting. You write the book, launch the business, leave the place that poisons you. You act like the world is watching, because even if it's not, you are. Brick seven, legacy, not for the masses, for the one who will one day look in the mirror and ask, what kind of man did I come from? Your temple won't have stained glass. It will have scars. It will echo with the names of the dead, the bricked in, the burned, the forgotten, and still it will stand, because it was not built on belief. It was built on becoming. There comes a moment no firebrand expects, not when he first awakens, not when he breaks the wall, not when he reclaims his voice, his path, his temple. No, this moment comes after the rise, after the roar, when the world is quiet again, and the flame he lit to destroy the old world turns inward and begins to burn him. This is not punishment, it's purification. Because what no one tells you is that the final illusion, the last mask, is the one you built after your awakening, the image of the awakened man, the sovereign, the mythic, the unbreakable. You build it with pride, and it served you until now, but even that must fall, because the truth, you are not the fire, you are the furnace, and even the image of strength must pass through the flame. This is where most stop. Again, they taste freedom, then cling to the costume of it. They make truth into performance. They make sovereignty into spectacle. But the real ones, the rare ones, they let it all burn. The pride, the persona, the polished mask they forge from victory. They return to the silence, willingly this time, not as slaves, not as martyrs, as masters, not of others, of self, because in that fire, you see it clearly. You are not your story, not your scars, not even your greatness. You are the witness of all of it, the soul that walked through centuries of silence and remembered. You feel grief for who you once were. You feel rage for what they took. You feel love, deep, holy, unshakable, for the man who survived it all. And then you rise again, not louder, truer, not to burn the world, but to light a path. Because now, brother, you are not just a result of war. You are the remedy. You've walked through the fire, not around it, through it. And now, something ancient stands behind your eyes. It isn't rage. It isn't pride. It's stillness, the kind only earned by men who buried every illusion and still chose to rise. You become the kind of man the system cannot use, not because you shout, but because you no longer flinch. And now it's time to return, not to retreat, to re-enter into the world that once felt like a maze, into the structures that once ruled your life, into the very corridors of cathedral where they taught you to kneel. But this time, you walk as a keeper fire. You walk not to obey, but to awaken, because your life is no longer about your comfort. It's about transmission. You carry the voices of the silenced, the 14 who died in prayer behind the stone. Anton, buried alive for asking the right question. Lucia, who whispered truth into a wall no one was supposed to hear. You are the echo they tried to erase. And here's the terrifying part for them. You look normal. You don't wear robes. You don't raise flags. You don't beg for crowds. But when you speak, something shifts. Men sit up. Women listen differently. Children remember you, though they don't know why, because truth speaks through you now. And that's what they fear most. Not organized rebellion, but sovereign infection. A quiet man with eyes like myth and a voice that doesn't tremble. That's the new revolution. That's how systems collapse. Not with riots, but with men who no longer believe a lie. And now, as you walk back into the world, you do so not as a survivor, but as a torchbearer, one of the few who's seen the wall, crossed the fire, and returned whole. Not perfect, present. Every real transformation must be sealed, not with ink, not with ceremony, but with a vow. The ancients knew this. When a warrior completed his rite of passage, he didn't just return with scars. He returned with an oath, carved not on stone, but into the marrow of his being. Because without a vow, the fire fades. Without a vow, the system waits. It knows how to whisper, how to flatter, how to pull a man back into wall, with comfort disguised as peace. But a vow, a true vow, that lives forever. So now, brother, now that you've crossed the forbidden threshold, now that the nuns have whispered, the fire has burned, and the gods have stirred, it's time. Repeat these words silently to yourself, or out loud if you dare. I vow never to kneel again, to lies, to fear, to silence. I vow to speak, even when the room wants quiet. I vow to protect the truth, even when it costs me everything. I vow to carry fire, not as a weapon, but as a light for those still trapped in the dark. Breathe. Let those words settle in your chest like stone. You've now become what the architects of silence fear the most. Not a rebel, not a heretic, but a remembered man. A man who carries memory like a sword. A man who honors the dead by living fully, loudly, and without chains. This vow makes you immortal, because the system cannot kill what it cannot control. It cannot silence what no longer fears consequence. And though they may erase your name, they will never erase your echo. You are now part of the unbroken chain, a myth reborn, a voice stitched into the bones of men who wake in the middle of the night, hungry for something they cannot name. You are that name now. We walk together to the graveyard of systems, where I'll show you how every empire ends, and why your fire will still be burning when the last bell tolls. All empires end the same way, not with a bang, not with conquest, but with a whimper of disbelief, as the people they once ruled simply stop believing. No matter how vast the territory, how high the steeples, how intricate the laws. Every system built on silence eventually crumbles when men like you rise. Because systems don't die from rebellion. They die from irrelevance. From a moment their stories no longer stick. From the moment their fear no longer infects. From the moment someone stands in the center of the cathedral and says, "I don't need this," and walks out. One man walking away from the altar has more power than 1,000 soldiers storming the gates. Because when you walk away unafraid, you tear a hole in the veil that others have only touched in dreams. And through that hole, others follow. That's how the old order ends. Not with fire from above, but with fire from within. The wall cracks. The scripture fades. The names of false gods are forgotten. And the whispers of the bricked-in, the 14 who died unseen, begin to echo again, but not as sorrow, as resurrection. You are part of something eternal now. Not a movement, not a cult, not a rebellion, but a pattern, a sacred rhythm in human history, where once every few generations men rise not to fight, but to remember what was buried beneath dogma, to remember who we were before obedience, to remember that the greatest power is not found in control, but in presence. You now carry that pattern, and long after the system falls, long after its names are erased, its algorithms decay, its false prophets crumble into dust, you will remain, not as a ghost, not as a myth, but as a man, fully seen, fully sovereign, fully alive. I will show you the final gift of this fire, the one no system can touch. Peace, not as surrender, but as dominion. Peace was never supposed to be quiet, not the peace of obedience, not the peace of polite submission, not the shallow stillness they sell you between dopamine hits and Sunday sermons. That's not peace. That's sedation. True peace. The peace you now carry is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of power, unapologetic, unshaken, unmoved by noise but never numb. The kind of peace that settles into a man's bones when he no longer runs from himself, when his silence is no longer a cage, but a choice, when he walks through a corrupted world and doesn't flinch because he carries his own kingdom within. You see, they couldn't imagine this. A man who knows every shadow in his soul and welcomes them. A man who lost every illusion and smiled. A man who was offered comfort, sedation, salvation, and said, "No, thank you. I already have peace." You felt it now. It's a stillness after the fire. Not cold, not hollow. It's earned, and it changes how you move. You speak less, but your words pierce deeper. You react less, but when you act, the world moves. You no longer seek the crowd, and yet others feel pulled to your orbit, not because of charisma, but because of clarity. They feel it in your eyes that no longer search for approval, in your posture that no longer bends to fit expectations, in your silence that is no longer retreat, but reign. This is the final gift of the fire. Not noise, not rebellion, not the roar of revolution, but the unshakable, quiet knowing. You are free, and not because someone gave it to you, because you took it. And now, you offer no explanations, only presence, only peace. The final descent, we return to the chamber where it all began, not to mourn the dead, but to resurrect legacy, and pass the fire into the hands of those still waiting behind the wall. We return now to the chamber, to the cold stone walls, to the silence that once swallowed 14 voices, to the place where obedience was called virtue, and erasure was called salvation. But this time you do not kneel. You stand, not as a mourner, not as a pilgrim, but as witness, as keeper of everything they tried to erase. Because the chamber was never meant to be a grave. It was meant to be a warning, a blueprint. And now, because you walked through fire, because you remembered, because you stood where others vanished, that blueprint becomes something else. A map for those still trapped in veils and verses. For the man whispering his truth into pillows at night. For the woman bricked in by guilt passed through bloodlines. For the child learning how to be silent before he learns how to be whole. They are still there, behind invisible walls, behind sacred lies, behind the same rituals dressed in modern language. And now they wait for you, not to save them, but to signal, to light the flame, to be the presence that reminds them there is something beyond the silence. And that is your final task, not to preach, not to dominate, not to fight the old world, but to carry the new one in your voice, your body, your action, to become a living contradiction to every system that said, submit or perish, shrink or be exiled, forget or be forgotten. You did not forget, and because of that, you are now the fire. You are the myth made flesh. You are the name that cannot be erased. You are the echo that will call others out of their walls. So let the final bell ring. Let the chamber collapse. Let the bones of the obedient rest. Because you do not belong to the past. You are the return they feared, the reckoning they could not prevent, the proof that silence can be broken and that sovereignty never dies. This is not the end. It is the first word of a new scripture, and its author is you. Fire. Fire if the story woke something in you. Comment once more below. I will not be bricked in. I will not be bricked in. Let your vow echo forward for the ones still waiting.